help? Would you think it would help to have the mic on? Probably.
My booming voice isn't.
Yeah, if you want to just clip that on, Jess.
We just want to hear your accent.
Yeah.
Switch to the F2 setting, like this, with a slider on there. F2?
Yeah.
We should have.
Can you hear? Is that right?
Go ahead, let's talk.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Buzz, I like the buzz.
Until we can figure out.
Okay, is that all right? Better? A little bit better? Yeah.
I didn't even notice that that's such a
Okay.
There we go.
Good.
Yeah.
It's a long plus one.
And then how, can you guys read that okay, the slide?
That just blends
If it gets out of focus or if it turns too small or something, just let me know. Deal with it. Okay. All right. So just back to, I guess, introduction. So I work as an independent consultant in international development. My expertise is in monitoring and evaluation specifically. We'll get to what that is a little bit later on in the presentation. So my background or the process of getting to this point, I guess, was, I'll try to give a brief overview. I went to school in Vanderbilt University in Southern California. I studied history and political science, and I did a brief stint with the Peace Corps in West Africa, in Niger. I didn't stay the full 2-year term, but left sort of a few months into the actual deployment process, but had a great experience with the Peace Corps. I loved it, and I can explain that process in a separate conversation. But yeah, it was a really good experience, and I learned a lot, kind of living at the ground level in West Africa, which is a very different context than I had grown up in Namibia. And from there, went back to South Africa and did a master's degree, and then worked with a youth development program that was based out of the UK, but had an office in South Africa, and worked with their regional program that worked throughout Africa, and traveled quite a bit with that. And from there, then joined a small research company in South Africa called Development Research Africa, which does a lot of development research throughout mostly South Africa at the time. And that's kind of where I cut my teeth, as it were, in the development consulting world, in terms of learning about what the applied research process looks like, in terms of designing proposals, learning about research methodologies of both qualitative and quantitative types, looking at what data collection looks like, different methodologies for doing that, and training and managing field teams, and managing data, and analyzing data, and then kind of managing clients too, in terms of how the data is presented, what clients expect from different types of research projects, and that sort of thing. So I was with them for a few years, and then after that, my wife and I started our own consulting company in South Africa called Reform Development Consulting, which I managed then for a few years while we were still in South Africa, doing very similar kind of work, lots of applied research, so like data collection of different types. We also then, during that time, began to kind of evolve into the program evaluation field as kind of a natural progression based on data collection and some of the applied research work that we had done. Yeah, and so that went well, and we took on quite a few big projects, and I think we were fortunate to do some pretty significant work. I think some pretty big program evaluations, impact evaluations, with some big international research teams and clients. And pretty good sized firm. I mean, at one point we had over 100 people on our payroll, which was exciting. We were able to kind of support a lot of people at that time. So I certainly learned a lot too. It's also difficult being reliant on by a lot of people for their salaries. Yeah, so it was shortly after that.
Let's go to the front door.
Kind of towards the end of that period, I guess, that my wife and I decided to move back to the US, mostly for personal reasons, to be closer to family, wanting to start a family of our own. All of my family, as well as my wife's family, had in the meantime moved back to the US. So we wanted to be closer for that, and kind of gradually shut down the consulting business, and then after sort of a sabbatical from it, which I needed after a bit of burnout, I think, came back into the sector, I guess, as an independent consultant, which has been good. It's been a nice kind of return to it for me, and so I've been working in this capacity now as an independent consultant for a few years. I mostly work with a consulting firm that's based out of Oxford in the UK called Oxford Policy Management. They're a global consulting firm in international development. They kind of were birthed out of the university, but don't have any relationship to the university at the moment. But it's a pretty sweet setup for me because I get to live at home in Colorado with my family, and I don't have to travel fairly regularly. So it's also a lesson in discipline of trying to manage the travel as well as workload and that kind of thing. Especially as an independent, because the income stream is always kind of dynamic and fluctuating. So it's sort of taken a little while, I think, to kind of really get that established and be comfortable with the work stream in that. But we're at that point now, which has been nice and a blessing. And I've started to work with a few other clients as well now. One based out of Washington, D.C. called International Relief and Development that does very similar work, a little bit more on the relief side as well, throughout the world, the developing world. Yeah, and then a few other possibilities. So I hope that gives sort of a bit of context for you of where I'm coming from. I suppose when it comes to the discussion here today, whatever little bit of expertise that I have in this topic that we're going to talk about was born mostly in my work with the company in South Africa, Development Research Africa, and then as well as my own consulting firm, the Reform Development Consulting, where we needed to find work, right? We needed to respond to requests for proposals or tenders to get work, to get projects, and that's kind of when that specific sort of skill set for myself, I guess, began to develop. Having said that, though, it's a slightly different kind of a skill set too than what we'll be talking about today, which is more about non-profit type funding, right? Which is different than consulting for-profit sort of funding. So there are some technical differences, and I'll get to this too in just a second as well. But I think, so even more so than specific expertise in any kind of grant writing or accessing funding for an NGO or nonprofit, my expertise would be more around the actual international development industry, if we can call it that, and being able to kind of speak to that more so than some of the technical specifics in the grant writing aspects, if that makes sense. So, with that said, a quick overview of what I've prepared today, and I'll speak to in a second about some expectations and a couple of little caveats as well before we continue. Some conceptual thoughts around sort of foundational shifts potentially to think about for us, and then some of the requirements in the international development industry. So this has to do with what I was referring to in terms of just kind of being a little bit more aware of the industry as a whole, I guess, and looking at some aspects of that. We'll look at sort of the development lexicon, monitoring and evaluation, value for money. These are some of the kind of key topics in the industry as a whole. Different types of resources that we might want to look at to access, particularly donors and then government sources. Can you see that okay? And then a few different approaches, perhaps, of how to start or how to think about what to do next. Some ideas maybe around strategy, topical approaches, and capacity. Okay? So I'd like to just start off with sort of establishing the premise of this and expectations. I think this is important to me in this discussion, just for me to communicate to you what kind of my understanding was coming into this in the preparation that I did, as well as for you to know that, and then also maybe if there's anything else that you can communicate to me too that you would like us to try to cover if we can. So my understanding, basically, we're wanting to kind of develop compassion link, and I hope it's okay if I use that term. I know it's slightly unofficial at the moment.
It's official as of today.
September
As of
1.
today. Yeah.
Today.
Good.
It's a good starting point then, isn't it?
Yes.
We're very avant-garde here. So developing compassion link and its component members income stream to be sustainable beyond the institution's conventional funding sources, such as churches and individuals, by accessing donor and other funding resources. Okay, so that's kind of my understanding or my communication of that idea for us today. If that finds traction.
Yes. Yes.
In the preparation process for this too, I had asked if there were any specific questions from the group, and I got a list back, which I'd like to just quickly run through if I can. Some of these we'll address, some we won't. Some I think I can kind of answer, or at least speak to, and some of them I can't. So I'll be honest when I can't as well. And you'll probably figure out when that is the case as well. Okay, so the first one, since Che, Healthcare Ministry, Sustain Hope, all fall under AGWM, 501c3, and we are not separate 501c3s, how does that affect our fundraising? This is one off the bat that I don't think I can necessarily answer. I think it's slightly more of an administrative type of a question. But I have some thoughts perhaps on how it might be being addressed already by different organizations that are already accessing funding in different ways, right? So I think the system to do so might already be in place a little bit. Is it correct that we apply for grants which would include administration, monitoring, and evaluation? Very quickly, yes. What types of donor-driven requirements are most common, stipulations, etc.? I think we'll touch a little bit about this. There's a whole section about requirements of the industry, which looks at some of the key topics that are really important to consider and that have become really integral with donor requirements. Is there a marketing plan to get us out to the field, expanding our base and getting the word out there? The marketing plan will be up to you to create, but I think my hope is that this discussion can help sort of start some questions, or at least plan some questions perhaps, and maybe start the process of thinking strategically in a few different areas of how to develop this further. One risk, and part of the importance to me of communicating some of these expectations at the outset, is that one risk with this topic is that we could go all over the place and we could spend weeks, literally weeks, covering the different components that I think all feed into this. So to try to avoid that, right, it's about making sure that these different expectations are clear and explicit, and perhaps to try to manage what we think we can get out of this, and then also to be strategic with how we want to then channel our efforts in moving forward from this. Because it also, I think it's really important as a way of being strategic and making sure that we are using our resources, both time and financial, as best as possible. What are some steps we need to take towards capacity building? Also, I think we've got a couple different slides about capacity questions that will try to get us thinking about that. What type of missionaries, desired skill sets, etc., do we target for strategic growth? Also, we'll look at that a little bit, and I think we'll have a little discussion about that, and it's another question that probably will come back to you guys to think about. What are some common discrimination clauses and policies of grant donors that could negatively impact grant applications? It's a good question. It's one that I'm not sure that I'll be able to answer, but we'll talk about that as well a little bit. How to navigate to and communicate with the right donors, also a very good question, which we'll touch on a little bit. Where do we even start? Good question. And I'll let you guys try to answer that, I think, at the end, too. How do we find companies that would want to give to organizations like ours? Good. Do you have recommendations for creating sustainable income streams? Capacity building. I hope so, but we'll see. Yes, but I think those streams exist and are out there and are definitely accessible. Are there any other specific questions or expectations that you would like to communicate to me and the group now before we keep going? Or does this kind of broadly cover?
I think so.
More or less?
What are you going to be doing for the next 20 years? As far as mission and calling and business and life and family. You don't have to answer every question.
Okay, I can defer that till later.
Just something to think about.
Okay, yeah, I'll get back to you. Okay, so we are okay to proceed then? Suggested categorization then as a result of those questions. Dad kind of suggested some of these, and I've sort of taken them and maybe rephrased them slightly. But these have also shaped the bulk of the substantive aspect of this presentation. So the first thing is the requirements of the industry, donor types, and then strategic approaches, or suggested strategic approaches. Okay, I need to just quickly cover this. A couple quick personal caveats, just to mention. So I've explained to you a bit about my professional background. As you possibly know, I come from an AGWM background. Grew up as a missionary kid to a couple fantastic parents in Namibia, Southern Africa. That's where I spent all of my formative years, from the time I was 4 until I was 18, on the mission field. Except for me, it wasn't the mission field, it was just home. And the US was always the foreign country to me when we would come back on furlough. And so, yeah, so I grew up in the developing world, and that was my life and my context. And I think also under the kind of the aegis of the AGWM banner as well. So have some familiarity with sort of some of the institutional aspects of what that looks like. I realize that it's different today in many ways than it was then. The way that missions is done and even thought about today is, I think, largely, well, it's largely familiar or similar still, but there are aspects too that are considerably different, which has been encouraging for me as an adult to see some of those evolutions, I suppose. So given that background, then as an adult and professional, I chose to fairly deliberately pursue a career in international development. So given those two sort of aspects of my life, if we want to, maybe it's a false separation, but those are two certain components. so given that that's clear, like it's also important that you understand that I'm approaching this discussion with a particular paradigm that's informed by those two significant aspects of my formation and my deliberate pursuits. So I say that too, and I think I articulate that to you just so that you know where I'm coming from, and please feel free to feed back to me too if any of the assumptions that I make throughout the presentation about international development and about you guys and your own organizations and your work are off or false or not quite aligned. Like, please feel free to feedback in that aspect. But just know that there is obviously a certain paradigm that's informing my approach to this. So a couple other further caveats. So I don't have extensive technical expertise in business development for donors in the US context. As I was explaining, my background with mostly in South Africa, but then even now with the work that I do with the guys in the UK, most of our procurement work is sort of from the consulting premise, so it's sort of a for-profit context. There are very, very, very similar aspects to how proposals are created in terms of thinking about methodologies, thinking about technical capacity and skills, and then just the broader development context, right? And so, like, there's international development speak and this sort of lexicon that goes with it. And so that's familiar. There's parts about the technical proposal writing and grant access in the US for nonprofits that is much less familiar to me. And I hope that's going to be okay for this discussion, but I think my hope is that I think we can kind of get a discussion going that will get us to the point where those are technical skills that you can access in various different channels and means. So I hope that's not a massive disappointment to you guys. Yeah, so my hope is to provide some sort of contextual starting points for further thinking and development. And then I can, I think, try to suggest different approaches for some strategic growth for the organizations right here. Okay, any questions on that before we go along? Is it okay if I keep going then?
Yep.
Just,
Yeah.
let me just say, if some of the terminology, and you referenced this a minute ago, but I think some of the terminology may be different for some of us here. And if it is, or we don't understand or something like that, I think I'm addressing more for the group than for you, but we must step in at that point and get clarification so that we definitely do understand. And it's good, I think it's important for us to be exposed to the development language and some of the terminology in that is not familiar.
Right.
So I just want to say that for all of us here, that if we don't understand it, ask, and then let's try to get a handle on some of the terminology that's different.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. And it's something that I sort of formally address later on with a couple of terms that I've used of sort of the development lexicon or this development speak, right, that has certain terminology like any kind of industry or sector does. And I'd try to provide a few examples of that, but I know too that it's my profession and I'm immersed in all the time too, so I'm also not aware of what a lot of it is, I think. So yeah, and I think that, especially that feedback too, I welcome in real time. Like, I don't think that you have to defer questions or anything like that. With that said, is there anything so far that's not clear that we've talked about that I've used or that we're not? Okay. Okay. Just in terms of format for the day too, how just thinking about questions or feedback, we can obviously have like formal sort of question and answer time at the end if you want to do it that way, or if you want to bring up questions as they arise, we can note them down and perhaps defer them to later or address them at the same time, depending on what seems the most appropriate.
But
What do you
questions
think?
at the end of segments,
Okay?
yeah, so that you have time to give your your
Okay.
content.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay. And then segments two. So, just in terms of timeline, so I should have asked you this beforehand, but is there a plan, sort of a break time?
We have lunch at 12,
That's at 12?
and if there's a natural break sometime for like a bathroom break, sometime before then, like
Okay.
halfway between now and then.
Yeah,
10:20, 10:30, maybe somewhere around in there
okay,
for a little transition.
yeah. How about, yeah, like 10:15 till 10:30 or something like that?
Yeah.
Something like that, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, all right, cool. Good. Any other questions or comments before we carry on? All right. Okay, so this next section I'd like to talk about, this is a fairly conceptual, I guess, section. And it's based on a lot of assumptions from my side, so please bear with me and please feel free, like I said, to tell me if I'm way off, or if this finds traction with where you're at. So here's my understanding of the current compassion funding status quo, is what I've called it, right? So you are reliant primarily on churches and individuals for funding, right, to support the ministry. I realize that there are occasional grants that you've received, kind of small scale for specific purposes, but for the most part, the general funding stream comes through churches and individuals. I think too, it's based largely on a kind of an emotive appeal. That's about the purpose of what you're doing. There's a very significant spiritual component of what that is. And so it's largely appealing to that kind of an emotional premise that people respond to. It requires frequent communication and maintenance. I know this growing up. I had to spend a lot of time going to churches and talking to churches and people about what was being done, right? And it's cumbersome and it's even burdensome, if I could say. It's also largely based on the relationship between the recipient, i.e. you, and the giver, right? The individual or the church. So it's also the very relational aspect of the person of the church trusting you, believing in you, knowing you for a long period of time, as well as, of course, believing in what the message that you're presenting to them, of what you're called to do, what you feel like your purpose and your ministry and your mission is. But the relational aspect is a key component. And then it's also prone to high levels of vicissitudes or changes and fluctuations, right? Given how kind of personalized the premise is, those changes are all the more amplified. So changes that could relate to a pastor changing or a board change, individual people's budgets or their own prosperity, right? These things affect your own cash flow. Sometimes in good ways and sometimes in negative ways. But they're also difficult to preempt or to buffer against because of how much it can vary. Do those sound kind of,
Oh, yeah.
yeah?
We relate.
Everybody
So
goes
there's-
painfully, yes.
So there's some traction there with some of those points, right? My understanding then of some of the global funding realities, and these might have to do with kind of broad level shifts and evolution that I think is happening in some of the larger global funding trends, which are much more around institutions or formal resource centers. So people are increasingly less likely to give to individuals but much more prefer more formalized structures like institutions or formal resource centers, like a specific fund or an agency or something, a sort of more formalized entity, if that makes sense. So there seems to be a lot more of a trend towards that type of giving, where people are more interested in that, perhaps because it seems to people, or there's a perception that there's greater accountability within a broader institutional type of a structure. The formality affords different types of accountability and kind of trust mechanism that can be set up that way. And then there's also much more premise or focus on kind of economic terms with funding as well, such as the ideas of impact and value for money. We're going to get to this a little bit more later on, but I think people are much more inclined to give when they are aware of what the return on their investment might look like. So even the terminology is becoming much more economic. By even saying that returns on investment, it's a very economic type of a term, right? But a person wants to know, if I give $1, what is going to happen with that? What is it translated to? So these are much more about real, kind of tangible impacts that people are interested in. There's also, with some of these shifts, increasingly rigorous accountability, which is a good thing. This is where the whole monitoring and evaluation function has arisen. Without getting into detail about the history of M&E, it largely is birthed out of some of the aid and humanitarian catastrophes, in a way, that have arisen in the 80s and 90s, of vast amounts of resources being squandered and used horrifically, kind of spawned what has become this monitoring and evaluation segment of international development, which is really about accountability and making sure that people and organizations that are granted funding and resources are using that wisely and as well as can be used. And that everything that goes into that is being tracked and monitored and essentially evaluated for its effectiveness and usefulness. So as much as some of the accountability measures can be quite onerous at times and difficult, they exist for a good reason. And I think in our understanding, we can really think about it as it's a stewardship issue. So that's a very big factor in this kind of global funding reality. And then the last thing that I have, funds generally tend to be fairly project-based, so having kind of discrete objectives and timeframes. So it's not just kind of an endless, let me give you a certain amount, either once off or an ongoing amount indefinitely, just because we know you or we trust you, we believe you're doing good things. But it's about a set amount of money. Here's $100,000 for 2 years to do X, Y, and Z. So that's the discretion aspect of it, with very clear objectives and timeframes and goals. So those are kind of some of what I kind of pick up, I guess, in the development world as some of the trends in that aspect. So going back to what we spoke about a minute ago, of some of kind of the status quo of the funding aspects for the compassion link, some of the challenges, and you might be able to speak to this more even than I can. But oftentimes, it's generally small scale with a limited degree of impact and scale, due to some of the way that the funding is sourced from many sort of small sources, right? In terms of churches and individuals, often kind of limits the degree of scale and impact that the funds themselves are able to achieve. When you have such a kind of a broad funding base, that's one of the characteristics that goes with it, because it also lends itself to these fluctuations and variations which are difficult to preempt, and also then limit really scale and impact. Then the high maintenance factor, that's relative to the level of investment. So also I think if we were to think in economic terms around the amount that you have to invest in to maintain the support that you receive, it's a high level of investment, isn't it? In terms of the amount of time that you have to spend traveling and speaking and engaging with your sort of your donor community. Yeah, proportionally, it's a high level of effort that's required to maintain that. Plus the fact that the donor base is geographically widespread and requires individual attention. And the individual aspect also raises that level of effort because you're communicating the same message essentially to 200 churches and hundreds of individuals, right, at different locations and in different ways. So that's also, it's an onerous task, and it's not actually particularly efficient as a use of time, having to maintain that. Then the issue of questionable sustainability, even perhaps increasingly unsustainable, perhaps. Like we mentioned a second ago, prone to these high levels of vicissitudes and fluctuations, and the kind of emotive appeal. If people suddenly shift what they're interested in at the moment, what do you do, right? If your appeal has to be based on that kind of emotive premise anyways, somebody suddenly shifts their attention from saving souls to treating dogs better, or having an environmental focus, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's your premise, you're also vulnerable to those types of fluctuations, right? So, hence the questionable sustainability, and difficult to preempt and to plan because of those things.
Justin, can I ask a question?
Depends on what it is.
So just out of the gate, I actually have a couple questions, but one, so in your premise, your idea, if this manner of operation, what we do today, was in the corporate world, they would go out of business.
Yes.
Can I ask you one more question? That was a good answer.
That's my opinion.
Uh-huh.
I mean, what do you guys think?
Yeah, when we were standing at General Council, and there were 70 missionaries at all times on that, I was thinking, cha-ching, cha-ching.
Yeah.
If we were actually paid on an hourly scale, that would have been ridiculous, unattainable.
Do you see a possible time or evolution, and it's very refreshing to see how your life has navigated both, AgWam and do you see a time or evolution to AgWam or to other 501c3s to move from a not-for-profit to a profit just to gain greater capacity and sustainability?
Yes, although I don't think it has to be exactly, you don't have to become for profit to be sustainable. I think the adoption, the adaptation process is changing the way that you approach your funding base. And ultimately, I think that's what we're here to try to talk about, right? And there are many nonprofit organizations that are donor reliant, but approach it in a way that is more sort of business minded and almost with a kind of corporate sense and feel and approach. And that I think is more sustainable. And so it sort of mirrors what the for-profit world looks like, but it's the fact that you're a nonprofit is like a technicality that is almost not that meaningful, or not that important in a good way. And I think that ultimately what I'm going to try to encourage you to do, or to think about, if I'm understanding your question correctly.
Yeah, it seems like we want to be a crafty entrepreneur that's familiar with every kind of world venue to raise asset awareness and an income stream, while at the same time being a godly person.
Yes.
That's what we want. So you almost have to have a foot in both worlds, kind of like what you have.
Yeah, and that's exactly so. And I think part of what I'm in the process of trying to kind of suggest as a foundational shift, and that might be a bit, hopefully not hubristic thinking from my part, but because maybe it's not a foundational shift at all actually, but is to try to move from thinking in more emotive terms, and as a disclaimer too, when I say emotive, I'm not trying to marginalize the spiritual aspects of what you guys do at all. Right? It's not about that as much as contextualizing it in this framework, right, for me, and trying to present how we understand what our message is that we are trying to present to a donor, but even more so, what is the service that we're trying to sell to a donor. So it's kind of like switching thinking from essentially, like, as a missions organization, you are selling an ideology, in a way. If you think about what you are going to do, if we're preaching the gospel, you're kind of selling an ideology of what you're wanting to do and what you are asking people to support. Whereas I think what is an increasingly more sustainable framework is to think about that differently. Think about it more as you're selling a service in a way, which can be perhaps difficult to wrap our heads around, but I think in the development context, that's really what it is about. And this relates to how some of these trends that we're looking at in terms of donors and people thinking about impact in kind of more economic terms. They want to know about how many kids are learning at school, how many people have been immunized, how much has GDP per capita increased over the 5-year program cycle from what it had started at. More like tangible levels of impact, right? That people can really say, okay, this is the change that I helped contribute to, and my investment yielded.
We at Healthcare have been writing incredibly emotive newsletters for the last year, and I gotta say the impact has been small in a positive way, but yeah, we're seeing that emotion doesn't work anymore.
And I think the emotion
Or completely.
Yes, and so that's an important qualifier too. I think in what I'm suggesting here today too, I'm not asking you or suggesting that you completely do a 180-degree shift away from what you have been doing. But it's more about, so perhaps shift is a misnomer, but so it's more about maybe reconceptualizing something that you maintain what you're doing, or retain what you're doing and how you do it in many ways, but there's a different way of communicating that. And I think on the emotive side of things, I think that trend is kind of like exhausted. And I think that's why there seems to be this bigger shift towards more tangibles, almost tangibles in kind of more in economic terms. Because the emotive stuff is just not yielding much anymore. So it's like that soil has been exhausted, it seems like. So as a result, we need to shift the way that we think about that as well. Dan, you were going to ask something?
Well, I want to get to that point because as long as we are a Christian organization, and I say it as one, and we do have churches and church or Christian individuals that support us, both institutionally and individually. We don't want to leave that behind. I mean, there is a tremendous value to both to us and to them, the churches and the individuals, to be tied together with this, as we all know. So I think and maybe it doesn't need to be said, maybe hopefully we're all just assuming that we are all on the same page with that, and we don't have to take a long time to elaborate on that there is nothing in this presentation that is suggesting that we leave that behind or that we don't need that anymore. But it's how do we adapt more broadly? How do we adapt to the changing landscape in the world that we're in?
I think it's more adding this aspect to the arsenal rather than leaving the other, because we're having to adapt in other ways in just the fundraising among churches. Now it's more individual based. They don't want to run it through the church. You're having to do much more with videos. I mean, there's lots and lots of changes in that area. But this is just kind of to add to the arsenal rather than to leave any of that.
And I think that changing landscape is still emotive, but it changes what people are emotional about. And and I think our being in tune with what's the latest trend in the emotional world of, like you all know, human trafficking. That's the big emotive push now in our churches, and unreached people. So if you're not involved in those, then people are wondering about you and dropping us, So I think there are these other trends that continue to be emotive, but they change. And we have to kind of be aware of what they're changing to.
You're right, and that's a good point too. And I mean, even in the development world, I can point to emotive elements of what's trending, what's kind of sexy at the time.
That's exactly.
Which is a terrible way to look at it, but it exists. And so, like in the development context, it's all parts of that are, addressing extreme poverty, which is people that live on less than $1.25 a day, or trying to build resilience for those who are the most extremely vulnerable, people in the margins, those sorts of similar kinds of emotive appeal. But there's also the slightly, I think, reconceptualization around how we look at that and how we understand that, which are kind of in some more economic terms than I think they've been in for a while. So the emotive, I think, is also wrapped up in the economy of it, right? So it's somehow emotionally appealing still to think about how having greater levels of impact is also emotionally appealing in a way too. But I think these are really important points, and I appreciate you bringing them up, Dad, for stating that. I say it shortly, I think, but that exact thing that this isn't trying to tell you to move away from something, but rather perhaps to think about including some different aspects. And really, what I think this is about actually is just about a slightly different packaging, perhaps, of what you are already doing. Because we're trying to look at identifying a different client, which are your donors. And so in a business world, a corporate world, if you want to go after a different client, you need to figure out what the client wants. And you need to use the same product that you have, but communicate its benefits, communicate what it can offer in a slightly different way that's sort of tailored to what the client is, right? And what the client needs are, and your sort of client specifications. But it really is about being sort of focused on that and how to not change what you're doing, but just repackage it, perhaps. And in doing so too, you don't leave behind your other clients. So, yeah, I hope that makes sense and is okay. Yes, here. Okay, so how do we address some of these challenges? The first thing, I think, is to, in many ways, to maintain, or at least to retain, the status quo. So don't get rid of the churches and individuals. Of course not. Like, that's not what this is about at all. But retain the emotive appeal too, because there's a lot of what we're doing that there's emotive elements to it, and that there is still a space for that. And also, of course, retain the presence and the pursuit of the sort of softer outcomes that we'll talk about. And I mean, don't think please for a second that I'm saying, you know, don't like leave the spiritual behind for the temporal. It's not about that at all. It's just it's a repackaging, I'm saying. So perhaps then this sort of reformulation maybe of what the work is that you're already doing. So in the context of the donors, maybe begin thinking of yourselves not just as missionaries, but as actual development practitioners,
Like that. That's good.
Yeah.
which is what you're doing. In my understanding of the organizations and the work that's represented here, you are all development practitioners, which is awesome, I think, because that's what I am. And I think in a spiritual context too, the virtue of that is that you all have specific technical skill sets that you're bringing to the table in the work that you do and the years of experience that you have. So this is not just kind of a fancy little label, it is genuine, it's real. And I think an important first step is perhaps that you think of yourselves that way and really embrace that. Because it doesn't mean that you're not the spiritual elements that you have been as well. You can be a missionary and a development practitioner. Think of it as the same thing. And that becomes more of a theological question, which I'm not going to get into. Yeah, and so in that too, like don't be afraid of wholeheartedly pursuing the temporal kind of outcomes that we'll talk about, while still including the spiritual. And take on the international development discourse into the organization's lexicon. So that's part of what we mentioned already a little bit. As with any kind of sector or industry, there's certain terminology that goes with it. And as you start to think about kind of focusing or targeting that sector, it's important to kind of take on some of the language that it uses too, because it's a part of an identity thing and a relation and a relevance thing, a number of factors like that that can kind of help connect you, that language helps a lot with.
Sorry, just to go back to the previous point there, the temporal outcomes you're talking about would be things like you mentioned earlier, increase in GDP or food production or community-wide health improvement, stuff like that.
Exactly, yeah. So, and I stated like that, I suppose, this is part of the paradigm that I'm coming here with, and I remember growing up, and even in my early adult life, and feeling like as I was thinking about the development path, that felt very disparate to the sort of missions organization that I had, or missions framework that I had grown up in. Right, that if we're feeding people, we're forgetting about their eternal souls, and that at that time at least there wasn't really a paradigm that could see them married very well. So it's sort of trying to speak to that idea that separated things, and I don't think should be separated, because I don't think they are.
I don't think they can be separated. I mean, I believe the word, the gospel, the good news, includes salvation of the soul, and it includes the physical part of our lives, and emotional part of our lives, and that's what we talk about all the time, of course.
Exactly.
Holistic approach, and I just don't think they can be separated.
I agree. Thy kingdom come is about the integration of all of that, right? And I'm sure we all think the same thing, which is probably why we're all here.
Yeah.
So perhaps it's a point that's framed in a way that's maybe addressed to a more purely kind of evangelical type of a mindset, maybe. But I know that for a long time, there wasn't a theology that was accepted that supported that idea.
Well, yeah, I think it still exists, but I think they could very much exist. Even, I mean, we even find people who embrace what we do, that will turn around and say, but let's also preach the gospel. I mean,
As though you're
because
not.
it's still separated in their mind.
Exactly, yes. there's always that but, like, we just have to make sure, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that comes from
Yeah.
all the way up to the top, down, I mean, it's still
From
our
top down
mentality.
and from years
Yeah.
of
Mhm.
hearing that,
Of
Andy's
institutional-
dad is an example of that. He, you know,
fully embraces.
let's don't preach the social gospel.
And there's a good reason for that, because that's the way of all the mainline organizational
Yes.
denominations.
Yes.
They went social.
Period.
So, yeah.
Yes, I mean.
But how far removed from that do we have to be before people begin to?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
History.
Anyway, yeah.
I'm glad you built that in though, because I think that I think what your point you were getting to is guarding, you wanted to guard the idea of not minimizing the temporal outcomes, because there is a spiritual involvement, so you, in the development side, you guard it against separating the two.
Yeah.
But I also think that with temporal outcomes, there are actually eternal values in that. And that's what I think that we have probably failed, many of us, at least as we have in our journey kind of to this point, we have probably failed to stop and consider that thoroughly, of what kind of eternal impacts there are in achieving temporal outcomes, and how important those really can be. Anyway, that's a whole nother discussion. I think that could be at least another day easily on this.
Yeah, and I
Explore
think,
that.
and that discussion, I think, it's a theology, or it's a question of our theology, right? Which is how do we see that? I mean, even the term of a social gospel. I mean, there's a whole history of almost a century now, at least, of very interesting. I was actually just reading a book review of something that just came out about politics and the church in America. But part of it touches on this idea of a social gospel and some of the convolutions that it goes through over the last century, and some of the politicization of some of the elements of that. And so there's all sorts of historical momentum behind a lot of these different terms. But I think the whole discussion broadly is do we have a theology that allows us to pursue, or that marries the temporal with the spiritual in a way that doesn't separate it like this so much?
Yeah.
And I
It's
think
coming. We're getting there.
Yeah.
Joanna's been really instrumental in that. I mean, you have her book, you've seen it, and and there's many others as well. But it is where we're moving that direction. I think as an organization, I think at least that's my feeling. Hopefully, is that we're getting some traction along that line. It's not. I wouldn't say widespread yet, but we're making ground. Making progress.
Yeah, and that's what it takes. And it takes a long time to create real institutional change around some of those really big ideological concepts, theological concepts in that case. Just from a personal point of view, it was a big evolution that I went through in my early adult years, I guess. Even before kind of my own professional development started to take place, it was part and parcel of my own spiritual kind of, I don't know if revolution is the right word, but just kind of creating my own theology in that way, I guess, was a really critically included that aspect of can these two things be married that I had always thought were quite divorced, I guess, in a way. So yeah, it's a super important topic, and I think especially for an organization that's premised on a missions background, right? That there be a theology that goes with that, and that you as an individual development practitioner, missionary, have that clearly articulated for yourself in your mind, and that you can communicate to people. Because I think it's important to be able to do that, especially to the more sort of spiritual basis of your of your donors. Any other thoughts on that one? Okay, so I had thought we could do a little activity if we'd like. We're getting kind of at the break time. So if this works, maybe we don't even need to take, just maybe 10 minutes is enough. We've already had a lot of good kind of dialogue, I think. It would be nice to hear a little bit more specifically, perhaps, about a few questions that I put up. So tell me if it works or not this way. I had thought perhaps we could organize around the different organizations that are represented here. And I don't know if I'm using the right term when I say organizations.
Teams.
Teams? Okay, teams.
And organizations. We got an organization.
Organization. So one organization and teams. So I don't know if you want to do that by teams or how many people are represented for teams, or else we could, for the sake of rigorous interaction, maybe have 4 people per group. Let's see, 13. You gotta have 4, 4, and 5.
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah. And then, so a few questions that I thought about. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, and perhaps alter the discussion if you think necessary, as you feel really is relevant and appropriate. Does what we've been talking about sound like a shift that we want to try to consider or think about? Is this even a shift, or is it something that is already happening for you guys? Is it more just a matter of repackaging, like we talked about? What would that look like, possibly? What would be a positive possibility of embarking on such a process? What would be maybe a negative possibility or aspect of this? Do those questions make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
More or less? You can adapt them if you need to.
Okay.
So you want to just number us? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2,
Oh,
3,
no,
4?
he said to go in
Or do you want us to go in groups?
in our teams. Oh, there you go.
Some teams only have one person.
Well, what works